Brian read the message 3 times before his coffee finished brewing, and by the time the machine beeped, he already knew. His son hadn't just cancelled a trip. He'd cancelled him. The phone lit up on the kitchen counter at 6:47 a.m., the way bad news always arrives, quietly, without warning, dressed up as just another notification. Brian Calloway was already awake. He'd been awake since 4 actually. Doing what 62-year-old men do when sleep stops being a guarantee and starts being a negotiation. He'd made coffee. He'd stood at the window watching the neighbors' sprinklers run their quiet circles in the dark. He'd thought about the trip, the one he and his son Marcus had been planning for nearly 8 months. 2 weeks. London, Paris. Then down through the south of France to a small coastal town Marcus had read about in some travel magazine and become obsessed with. Brian had already bought new luggage. It was still in the corner of the bedroom, tags on, zippers gleaming. The phone buzzed. He almost didn't pick it up. He'd told himself he was done checking his phone before sunrise. His therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Ellison who charged too much, and was worth every penny, had suggested it as part of what she called reclaiming your mornings. But something pulled at him. Some thread of instinct that parents never fully lose. No matter how old their children get, no matter how many years of silence or distance or polite, surface, level phone calls pass between them. He picked it up. Plans changed. You're not coming to Europe. The tickets are cancelled. I'll explain when I'm ready. Don't call. Brian set the phone back down on the counter. He picked up his coffee mug. He stood very still. He thought about the luggage. There is a particular kind of hurt that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive like a storm, all thunder and breaking glass. It arrives like a slow leak. The kind you don't notice until you step out of bed one morning, and find the floor wet beneath your feet. Brian Calloway had been stepping around that wet floor for years. He just hadn't admitted it. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a bad father. He had been present. He had showed up to school events. Had coached Little League one catastrophic season when Marcus was 9 and Brian knew absolutely nothing about baseball, but signed up anyway, because Marcus had wanted him to. He had paid for college without complaint, had helped Marcus move 3 times in 4 years as the boy found himself, lost himself, and found himself again. He had tried. But trying and succeeding are 2 different countries, and Brian had spent most of Marcus's life standing at the border between them. Never quite sure which side he was on. The divorce had been the fault line. Not just for the marriage. Those tectonic plates had been shifting long before anyone admitted it, but for everything that came after. Marcus was 14 when Brian and Sandra separated. 14 is the worst possible age for a child to watch his parents become strangers to each other. Too old to be shielded from the reality. Too young to process it with any grace. Marcus had watched his father pack boxes on a Saturday in October, and something in his face that day, some door behind his eyes, had quietly swung shut. Brian had spent the next 18 years trying to find the key. He didn't call. He followed the instruction in the text, which felt like following a rule handed down by someone with authority over him, which was perhaps the strangest part of all. His son was 32 years old. Marcus owned a consulting business, had a serious girlfriend named Petra, ran half marathons on weekends. He was by every external measurement, a fully realized adult human being. And yet one text from him at 6:47 in the morning, had turned Brian back into the man standing in the driveway with boxes. Watching a door close, he went to work. He taught his Tuesday morning section. Introductory American History at the community college where he'd been a professor for 20 years, and he was fine. He was professional. He explained the causes of the Civil War with the same organized clarity he always brought to the subject. Fielded 3 questions from students who were actually engaged and 2 from students who were clearly just hoping for partial credit. He ate lunch alone in his office. As he often did, grading papers with a red pen that was running low on ink. He did not pick up his phone. He did not call Marcus. But he thought about him. He thought about the trip. He thought about what 8 months of planning meant, the shared Google document they'd built together. Marcus adding restaurants and museums. Brian adding historical sites and one embarrassingly comprehensive spreadsheet of train schedules. He thought about the evening 3 months ago when Marcus had called. unprompted, to talk about a documentary he'd watched about the beaches of Normandy, and how he thought they should add that to the itinerary, and how Brian had felt during that call, warm, quietly thrilled, like a man who'd been holding his breath for years and had finally, cautiously, begun to exhale. That exhale was still somewhere in his chest. He could feel it sitting there, unfinished. On Wednesday evening, Marcus called. Brian answered on the second ring, which he was proud of. He'd spent most of Wednesday coaching himself not to answer on the first ring, because answering on the first ring would communicate too much. Desperation, hurt, the particular vulnerability of a father who has spent too many years waiting by a phone that doesn't ring enough. He answered on the second ring and said hello in a voice he hoped sounded neutral. Dad. Marcus's voice was tight. The voice of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation and now finds, standing at the edge of it, that the words aren't quite where left them. Marcus. A pause. I owe you an explanation. You owe me whatever you want to give me. Brian said, which was true and also cost him something to say. Marcus exhaled. Then he told him. It came out in fragments at first, incomplete sentences, things started and then redirected. But Brian was a patient man, a professor by trade and by temperament. And he waited. He listened the way he'd learned to listen over 24 years of office hours with students who didn't know how to ask for what they needed. He listened without filling the silence. The story assembled itself slowly. Marcus and Petra had been struggling for longer than anyone knew. The Europe trip had been, in Marcus's mind, something he needed to do differently. He'd imagined proposing to Petra somewhere along the Seine, had the ring, had the plan, had been quietly carrying both for 6 weeks. And then 3 days ago, on a Sunday evening in their apartment, Petra had told him she needed space. Not a fight. Not a blow-up. Just a conversation, steady and heartbreaking, in which she explained that she wasn't sure she was where she thought she was, and that she needed time to figure it out. The trip had fallen apart, the proposal had fallen apart, and Marcus, at 32 years old, for all his accomplishments and his half-marathons and his consulting business, had found himself standing in the wreckage of something he'd been building quietly for 2 years, and hadn't known who to call. I didn't want to tell you, Marcus said. Because I knew you'd, I don't know, I knew you'd be kind about it. And I wasn't ready for that yet. Brian sat with that for a moment. I didn't know, he said carefully, that my being kind about something was a problem. It's not a problem. It's, Marcus, just hard sometimes. Accepting things from you. I don't always know how. There it was. The sentence Brian had been waiting years to hear, not because it indicted him, it didn't, not entirely, but because it was honest. Because it was the door opening, just slightly, in a way it hadn't opened before. I think I understand that, Brian said. More than you might think. They talked for 2 hours, not about the trip eventually. Not about Petra, at least not primarily. They talked about the divorce, which they had never talked about directly as adults. They talked about the Saturday in October when Brian had packed boxes, and Marcus said, he remembered that day down to the color of the tape Brian had used on the cardboard, brown packing tape, the cheap kind, and Brian was staggered by that. By the fact that his son had held on to that detail for 18 years the way you hold on to something that matters. He told Marcus things he hadn't said before. That leaving had felt like surgery he'd performed on himself without anesthesia. That he had driven away that October afternoon, and had to pull over twice on the highway because he couldn't see the road. That he had never, not for one single day, not known how to bridge the distance that opened up between them after. Not because he didn't want to, but because every time he thought he was building something toward Marcus, he couldn't tell if Marcus wanted him to keep building, or to stop. Marcus was quiet for a long time after that. I wanted you to keep building, he said finally. His voice was different. Stripped of something. I just didn't know how to say that. The trip didn't happen in the spring. But in September, 8 months later, enough time for things to shift and settle. Brian and Marcus stood on the cliffs above a small coastal town in the south of France. The one Marcus had read about in the magazine, and never stopped thinking about. The water below them was the color of something Brian didn't have a word for, Some blue that existed only at that latitude, at that hour. In that particular slant of late afternoon light. They'd added Normandy to the itinerary. Brian had wept quietly at the beach, the way he'd suspected he might. And Marcus had stood beside him without saying anything. Which was exactly right. Marcus was still figuring things out with Petra. The ring was still in a box in his apartment waiting. Some things don't resolve on any schedule you can plan for. And Marcus, for the first time in his adult life, seemed to be making peace with that. Brian had new luggage. He'd bought it after the old set, the gleaming tagged, optimistic set from the spring, had been donated to a thrift store as an act of deliberate letting go, which Dr. Ellison had called healthy, and which Brian had called painful, and which were, perhaps, the same thing. Standing on the cliff, his son beside him, the sea stretching out in every direction, Brian thought about the 6047 text. He thought about the way bad news arrives quietly, dressed up as just another notification. He thought about how the worst morning of that year had, by a long and crooked road, led him here. His son put a hand briefly on his shoulder. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said.